My mother-in-law rearranged my entire kitchen while I was at work, so I changed the locks. Have you ever come home from work to find your entire life rearranged without your permission? I'm talking about someone walking into your sacred space, moving every single thing you own, and then acting like they did you a favor. Well, that's exactly what happened to me, and what I did next shocked my entire family. This is the story of how my mother-in-law learned the hardest lesson of her life about boundaries. And trust me, you're going to want to hear every single detail. Stick around because the revenge I served up was absolutely chef's kiss perfect. Let me set the scene for you because context is everything in this situation. My husband Mark and I had been married for 3 years, and we'd finally moved into our dream apartment after saving for what felt like forever. This wasn't just any apartment, it was our first real home together, a place we'd chosen, decorated, and organized exactly the way we wanted. Every item had its place, every drawer was arranged with purpose, and my kitchen was my absolute sanctuary. I'm not even exaggerating when I say I spent weeks perfecting the layout, measuring cabinet space, and organizing everything so that cooking was an absolute joy. My kitchen wasn't just functional, it was a reflection of me, my personality, and my way of doing things. Now, my mother-in-law Linda had always been what you might call involved in our lives. She had opinions about everything, from the color we painted our bedroom to the brand of laundry detergent we used. Mark always brushed it off, saying that's just how she was, that she meant well and that I should just ignore the comments that bothered me. I tried, I really did, because I loved my husband and I didn't want to be the wife who caused problems between him and his mother. But there's a difference between offering unsolicited advice and completely disrespecting someone's personal space, and Linda was about to cross that line in the most spectacular way possible. It started on a Tuesday morning, completely ordinary and unremarkable in every way. I kissed Mark goodbye, grabbed my coffee tumbler, and headed out for what I thought would be a normal day at work. I'm a marketing coordinator at a mid-sized firm, and Tuesdays are usually our busiest days with client meetings and project deadlines. Mark had given his mom a spare key to our apartment a few months earlier because she'd been helping us with some furniture deliveries while we were at work. I'd been hesitant about it at the time, but Mark assured me it was temporary and that she'd only use it for emergencies or scheduled visits. Little did I know that Linda had a very different definition of emergency than I did. My workday was long and exhausting, filled with back-to-back meetings and a presentation that didn't go quite as smoothly as I'd hoped. All I could think about during my commute home was kicking off my shoes, ordering some takeout, and relaxing on the couch with a glass of wine. I walked through my apartment door around 6:30 in the evening, completely unprepared for what I was about to discover. The first thing I noticed was that something smelled different. Not bad, just different, like cleaning products and something floral. Then I walked into my kitchen, and I swear my heart stopped beating for a solid 5 seconds. Every single thing in my kitchen had been moved, rearranged, and reorganized without my knowledge or permission. My carefully curated spice rack that I'd arranged alphabetically was now sorted by color, which made absolutely no sense whatsoever. The pots and pans I kept in the lower cabinets for easy access were now stuffed in the upper cabinets where I could barely reach them. My baking supplies that I stored near the oven were now scattered across 3 different cabinets. The dish towels I'd folded and placed in a specific drawer were now hanging on hooks I didn't even know I had. It was like walking into a parallel universe where everything looked familiar, but nothing was where it should be. But wait, it gets worse. So much worse than just rearranging my stuff. Linda had also thrown away several items she deemed unnecessary or outdated without asking me first. My favorite wooden spoon that I'd had since college, gone. A set of mismatched mugs that each had sentimental value from different trips Mark and I had taken, missing. My grandmother's vintage measuring cups that weren't even hers to touch, nowhere to be found. She'd even rearranged my refrigerator, throwing out condiments she thought were taking up too much space and reorganizing my meal prep containers. I stood there in complete shock, my brain struggling to process the absolute audacity of what had happened. That's when I spotted the note, sitting proudly on my completely rearranged counter like a trophy. It was written in Linda's perfectly neat handwriting on her personalized stationery because of course it was. The note said, "Sweetie, I noticed your kitchen was a bit disorganized, so I took the liberty of fixing it up for you. Everything makes so much more sense now. You're welcome. See you Sunday for dinner. Love, Mom Linda." I read that note 3 times, each time feeling my blood pressure rise a little higher.
She actually thought she'd done me a favor, like I was some incompetent child who couldn't organize my own kitchen. The sheer presumption of it all made my hands shake with anger. I immediately called Mark, who was working late at the office that evening. My voice was surprisingly calm when he answered, but I could hear the tremor of rage underneath every word I spoke. I explained the situation as clearly as I could, describing the chaos that had replaced my perfectly organized kitchen. Mark's response was exactly what I expected, but still managed to disappoint me completely. He sighed heavily and said, "Babe, I know it's frustrating, but she was just trying to help. You know how she is. Can we talk about this when I get home?" That response right there, that dismissive brush-off, was the moment I realized I was completely on my own in this situation. I spent the next 2 hours documenting everything with photographs and making a detailed list of every single item that had been moved or thrown away. I'm talking detailed documentation, before and after photos from the day I'd originally organized, pictures of every opened cabinet, close-ups of the missing items, screenshots of receipts for the things she'd tossed. This wasn't just about a messy kitchen anymore. This was about principle, about boundaries, and about respect. I was methodical in my documentation because I knew that when I finally confronted Linda, I wanted receipts, literal and figurative. My anger had transformed into something cold and calculated, and I was planning my response with military precision. When Mark finally got home around 9 that night, he walked into the kitchen and I watched his face carefully for his reaction. He looked around, nodded slowly, and said, "Okay, yeah, she definitely went overboard here." Went overboard? That was the understatement of the century, but at least he was acknowledging that his mother had crossed a line. We sat down and had a long conversation about boundaries, respect, and the fact that his mother had literally violated our privacy by going through every single drawer and cabinet in our home. Mark agreed that we needed to talk to her about boundaries, but he wanted to handle it gently because she's sensitive and means well. I agreed to let him take the lead on talking to her, but I had my own plans brewing in the background. The next morning, I woke up with a renewed sense of purpose and a plan that was absolutely brilliant, if I do say so myself. I called a locksmith and scheduled an appointment for that very afternoon to have all our locks changed. I wasn't being dramatic or petty. Well, maybe a little petty, but this was primarily about security and boundaries. Linda had proven she couldn't be trusted with unlimited access to our home, so that access needed to be revoked immediately. The locksmith was professional, efficient, and didn't ask questions about why a young woman needed her locks changed in the middle of the day. Within 2 hours, our entire apartment had new locks, and I had the only copies of the new keys safely in my possession. But changing the locks was just the beginning of my master plan for revenge and boundary setting. I spent my lunch break that day shopping online for a very specific item, a smart doorbell camera with crystal clear video and audio recording capabilities. I wanted a system that would alert us every time someone approached our door and would record any attempts to enter. This wasn't about spying on Linda specifically, but more about ensuring we had evidence if she tried to use her old key or somehow get into our apartment again. I paid extra for next-day delivery because I wanted that security system up and running as soon as humanly possible. The satisfaction I felt clicking purchase was absolutely incredible. I also took the liberty of creating a very detailed document outlining house rules for any future visits from family members. This document was professional, clear, and absolutely airtight in its language. It specified that all visits must be scheduled at least 24 hours in advance, that under no circumstances was anyone permitted to enter our home when we weren't present, and that rearranging, moving, or disposing of our belongings without explicit permission was absolutely prohibited. I even included a section about respecting our privacy and personal space with specific examples of what was and wasn't acceptable behavior. Mark read through it that evening, and while he thought I was being a bit extra, he couldn't argue with any of my points because they were all completely reasonable. Thursday evening arrived, and Mark called his mother to have the talk about boundaries and respect. I sat next to him on the couch, listening to his side of the conversation and watching his expressions carefully. Linda's voice was loud enough that I could hear her responses even though the phone wasn't on speaker. She was defensive from the very first second, insisting she'd only been trying to help and that she couldn't understand why we were being so ungrateful. Mark tried to explain gently that while we appreciated her intentions, she'd overstepped by entering our home without permission and throwing away our belongings. Linda's response was to cry, claim she was being attacked, and accuse me specifically of turning her son against her. This is where things got really interesting, and I'll admit I took a certain satisfaction in what happened next. Mark, to his credit, actually stood up for me and our boundaries. He told his mother firmly that the locks had been changed and that she would no longer have access to our apartment without us being present. The silence on the other end of the phone was absolutely golden, stretching out for what felt like an entire minute. When Linda finally spoke again, her voice had shifted from tearful to absolutely furious. She demanded to know who had made this decision, insisted it was disrespectful and hurtful, and threatened not to speak to us until we came to our senses. Mark remained surprisingly calm and simply told her that this was a decision we'd made together as a couple and that it was final. Friday morning brought an absolute barrage of text messages from Linda to both Mark and me. She'd apparently spent the entire night stewing in her anger and had decided to go on the offensive. Her messages to Mark were guilt trips about how she'd raised him better than this and how disappointed she was in the man he'd become. The messages she sent me were thinly veiled accusations, suggesting I was controlling, manipulative, and trying to isolate Mark from his family. I screenshotted every single message from my records and showed them all to Mark when he got home from work. Seeing his mother's true colors spelled out so clearly in text form seemed to open his eyes to patterns of behavior he'd been excusing for years. The smart doorbell camera I'd ordered arrived Saturday morning, and I installed it myself with the help of a very detailed YouTube tutorial. The setup was surprisingly simple, and within an hour I had a fully functional security system monitoring our front door. I tested it multiple times, appreciating the crystal-clear video quality and the instant notifications that popped up on my phone every time someone approached. The camera had night vision, two-way audio, and cloud storage for all recordings. It was perfect, and I felt a sense of security I hadn't realized I'd been missing. The timing of this installation would prove to be absolutely perfect in ways I couldn't have anticipated.
Sunday arrived, and with it came the weekly family dinner we usually attended at Linda's house. Mark had texted his mother on Saturday to let her know we'd still be coming to dinner because we wanted to work things out. I was hesitant about going, but Mark convinced me it would be a good opportunity to set boundaries in person and move forward. I agreed, but I was prepared for drama and had already planned my responses to whatever Linda might throw at me. We arrived at her house at the scheduled time, bringing a bottle of wine and a store-bought dessert because I certainly wasn't going to spend my time baking for someone who'd violated my home. The dinner was awkward from the very first moment we stepped through Linda's front door. She greeted Mark with a huge hug and completely ignored me, not even making eye contact. Throughout the meal, she directed all her comments and questions to Mark while treating me like I was invisible. When I tried to contribute to the conversation, she would talk over me or change the subject entirely. Linda's husband, Mark's father David, looked uncomfortable but said nothing, clearly having learned long ago to stay out of his wife's battles. The passive-aggressive tension was so thick you could cut it with a knife, and I spent most of the dinner pushing food around my plate while planning my exit strategy. Then came the moment that made the entire uncomfortable evening worth it. As we were clearing the dinner plates, Linda made a comment that was clearly designed to hurt me. She looked at Mark and said, loud enough for everyone to hear, "You know, sweetheart, when you're ready to have a real home that's properly organized, you should move closer to us. I could help you set up a kitchen that actually makes sense." The implication was crystal clear. My home wasn't a real home, my organization didn't make sense, and I was somehow inadequate as a homemaker. The room went silent, and I felt Mark tense up beside me. This was the moment I'd been waiting for, my opportunity to respond without losing my cool. I set down the plates I'd been holding, looked Linda directly in the eye, and spoke in the calmest voice I could manage. I said, "Linda, I need you to understand something very clearly. Our home is organized exactly the way we want it, and it functions perfectly for our needs and lifestyle. When you entered our apartment without permission, went through our private belongings, and threw away items that belonged to us, you didn't help. You violated our trust and our boundaries."
I watched her face turn red as I continued. That's why we changed the locks, and that's why you won't be entering our home again without us being present. This isn't about being ungrateful, it's about basic respect. The silence that followed my statement was absolutely deafening. Linda's response was immediate and explosive, exactly as I'd expected, but more dramatic than I had imagined. She stood up from the table so fast her chair tipped over, pointed her finger at me, and launched into a tirade about disrespect, ungrateful daughters-in-law, and how she'd done nothing but try to help. She claimed I was brainwashing her son, destroying their family relationship, and being completely unreasonable about a little reorganizing. Mark tried to interject multiple times, but his mother was on a roll, her voice getting louder and shriller with each accusation. David finally spoke up and quietly suggested everyone calm down, but Linda was having none of it. She demanded that Mark choose between his wife and his mother right then and there. That ultimatum was the biggest mistake Linda could have made, and I could see the moment Mark's expression shifted from uncomfortable to angry. He stood up, took my hand, and said very calmly, "Mom, I don't need to choose because there's no competition here. I chose my wife when I married her, and I'm choosing her now. You crossed a serious line, and instead of apologizing, you're making demands and attacking the woman I love." His voice was steady but firm as he continued, "We're leaving now, and we won't be back until you're ready to apologize and respect our boundaries. I love you, but this behavior is unacceptable." We walked out of that house with Linda screaming behind us about betrayal and disrespect, and I've never been more proud of my husband than I was in that moment.
The drive home was quiet at first, both of us processing what had just happened. About halfway home, Mark reached over and squeezed my hand, apologizing for not standing up to his mother sooner. He admitted he'd been minimizing her behavior for years, making excuses because it was easier than confronting her. We talked about boundaries, family dynamics, and what our relationship with his parents would look like moving forward. Mark agreed that his mother's behavior had been completely out of line and that the lock change had been absolutely necessary. For the first time in our marriage, I felt like we were truly on the same page about his mother, and it was an incredible relief. Monday morning brought the most satisfying notification I've ever received on my phone. At 8:15 a.m., while Mark and I were both at work, my doorbell camera alerted me to movement at our front door. I opened the app and watched in real time as Linda approached our apartment door, looking around nervously as if checking to see if anyone was watching. She pulled a key from her purse, clearly the old key that no longer worked, and attempted to insert it into the lock. The camera captured her confused expression perfectly as the key wouldn't turn. She tried several more times, jiggling the key and pushing on the door, growing increasingly frustrated. Then she actually tried to force the door open by pushing her shoulder against it. I immediately took screenshots and started screen recording as Linda's behavior escalated to absolutely unhinged levels. She was now banging on the door, calling out for Mark and me even though she clearly knew we were at work. She tried the key again, then actually got down on her knees to peer through the gap under the door, as if that would somehow help. The camera's audio picked up her muttering to herself about how disrespectful we were and how she just wanted to finish organizing. She stayed at our door for a full 20 minutes, trying the key periodically and occasionally knocking. Finally, she gave up and walked away, but not before leaving a long, rambling voicemail on Mark's phone about how hurt she was that we'd locked her out. I sent the video footage to Mark immediately, and his response was a string of disbelief and anger emojis. He called me during his lunch break and we discussed how to handle this latest violation. The fact that Linda had tried to enter our apartment without permission, even after our explicit conversation about boundaries, proved that she hadn't learned anything from the weekend's confrontation. Mark was genuinely shocked and hurt by his mother's behavior, finally seeing with his own eyes how little she respected our boundaries. We decided that he would call her that evening and address this directly, making it clear that attempting to enter our home without permission was not only disrespectful, but could be considered trespassing. That evening's phone call between Mark and his mother was even more explosive than Sunday's dinner confrontation.
Linda initially denied trying to use her key, claiming she'd just stopped by to drop something off and knocked on the door. When Mark told her we had video footage of the entire incident, including her trying to force the door open, she changed her story. She claimed she had the right to check on her son's well-being and that we were being paranoid and controlling by installing cameras. Mark calmly explained that attempting to enter someone's home without permission after being explicitly told not to was crossing a serious line. Linda's response was to double down, insisting she'd done nothing wrong and that we owed her an apology for changing the locks in the first place. The conversation ended with Mark telling his mother that we needed space and wouldn't be in contact until she was ready to genuinely apologize and respect our boundaries. Linda hung up on him mid-sentence, and we received a series of increasingly unhinged text messages over the next several hours. She called me every name in the book, accused me of stealing her son, and threatened to tell the whole family about how we were treating her. I saved every message, every voicemail, and every piece of evidence because I had a feeling we might need documentation if things escalated further. Mark was devastated by his mother's behavior, but also relieved that we'd taken the steps we had to protect our home and privacy.
The next few weeks were blissfully peaceful and drama-free for the most part. We didn't hear from Linda directly, though we got some confused texts from Mark's siblings asking what was going on. Mark was honest with them about the situation, sending them the video footage and explaining the boundary violations. His younger sister was completely on our side, admitting that Linda had boundary issues with her too, but she'd never stood up to their mother. His older brother was more neutral, suggesting we all just needed to communicate better, but he at least acknowledged that entering our home without permission was inappropriate. The family dynamics were shifting, and Linda's behavior was finally being called out instead of excused. During this peaceful period, I completely reorganized my kitchen back to exactly how I'd had it before Linda's invasion. It took me an entire Saturday, but the satisfaction of putting every single item back in its proper place was incredibly therapeutic. I even bought replacement items for the things Linda had thrown away, including a new wooden spoon that I used to make Mark's favorite pasta dish. My kitchen was once again my sanctuary, arranged with purpose and care. Every time I opened a cabinet and found exactly what I needed right where I expected it, I felt a sense of victory and vindication. About a month after the doorbell camera incident, we received an unexpected visitor at our door. The camera alerted me to David, Mark's father, standing nervously outside our apartment. This was significant because David rarely involved himself in family drama and had never visited our apartment without Linda. Mark and I exchanged glances before opening the door and inviting him inside. David looked uncomfortable but determined as he sat down on our couch. He apologized for not speaking up during the dinner confrontation and admitted he'd been enabling Linda's controlling behavior for their entire marriage. He told us he'd been going to therapy to work on setting his own boundaries with his wife and wanted to apologize for the way Linda had treated us. David's visit was surprisingly healing and gave us hope that family relationships could be repaired with work and accountability. He shared that Linda was also in therapy, though she'd been resistant at first and had only agreed after he'd threatened separation. Apparently, the incident with us had been a wake-up call for David about patterns he'd been ignoring for decades. He told us that Linda's controlling behavior had affected all their children at various points, but everyone had just learned to work around it rather than confront it. Our decision to set firm boundaries had actually inspired both him and Mark's sister to start setting their own boundaries. David asked if we'd be willing to attend a family therapy session with Linda once she'd made some progress in her individual sessions. We told David we'd think about it, and after he left, Mark and I had a long discussion about what we wanted our relationship with his mother to look like going forward. We both agreed that any reconciliation would need to include a genuine apology from Linda, acknowledgement of her boundary violations, and a commitment to respecting our privacy and autonomy. We weren't interested in rug sweeping or pretending the incidents hadn't happened. If Linda wanted a relationship with us, she would need to do the work to rebuild trust. We also agreed that she would never have a key to our home again, regardless of how much progress she made in therapy. That level of access required a level of trust that had been permanently broken. It took another 2 months before we heard directly from Linda herself.
She sent a carefully worded email, clearly written with her therapist's guidance, acknowledging that she'd violated our boundaries and privacy. The email apologized specifically for entering our home without permission, for rearranging our belongings without consent, for throwing away our property, and for attempting to enter our home after we'd changed the locks. She admitted she'd struggled with controlling behavior for most of her life and was working on understanding why she felt the need to manage everyone around her. The email ended with a request to meet for coffee in a neutral location to discuss how to move forward. It wasn't a perfect apology, but it was a genuine start.
We agreed to meet Linda at a coffee shop the following weekend, with the understanding that this was the beginning of a process, not an immediate fix. The meeting was awkward at first, with Linda clearly uncomfortable with the vulnerability required for honest conversation. She struggled to make eye contact and kept apologizing repeatedly, as if saying sorry enough times would erase what had happened. Mark and I had prepared talking points beforehand about what we needed moving forward: advance notice for visits, respect for our decisions about our home, and healthy boundaries. Linda listened more than she talked, which was unusual for her, and seemed genuinely committed to making changes. We left that meeting with cautious optimism but clear expectations. The family therapy session that David had mentioned finally happened about a month after our coffee shop meeting. It was facilitated by a skilled therapist who didn't let anyone deflect or avoid difficult topics. Linda had to confront how her need for control stemmed from anxiety and fear of being unneeded by her adult children. Mark had to process years of having his boundaries overstepped and his feelings minimized. I got to express how violated and disrespected I'd felt when my home was invaded and my belongings were disposed of. The session was emotionally exhausting, but incredibly productive, and we all left with homework assignments and commitments to continue the work individually and as a family. 6 months after the kitchen incident, our relationship with Linda has improved dramatically, but looks very different than it did before. She now texts before visiting and respects when we say we're not available. She asks before offering advice or help, rather than just barging in with her opinions and actions. She's working on accepting that Mark and I have our own way of doing things that might not match her preferences. We see her regularly for family dinners, but there's a new respect in our interactions that didn't exist before. The locks on our apartment remain changed, and the doorbell camera stays active, because while we're rebuilding trust, we're also maintaining healthy boundaries. Looking back on the entire situation, I have zero regrets about changing those locks or installing that camera. Some people might think I overreacted or was too harsh, but I firmly believe that boundaries without consequences are just suggestions. Linda had been given chance after chance to respect our autonomy, and she'd consistently chosen to prioritize her own wants over our needs. The lock change wasn't really revenge, it was self-protection. The real revenge was watching Linda face consequences for her actions for probably the first time in her adult life. She'd spent decades controlling her family through guilt and boundary violations, and our refusal to play along disrupted that entire dynamic. The situation also taught me valuable lessons about standing up for myself and my needs in relationships. I'd spent the first few years of my marriage trying to be the perfect, agreeable daughter-in-law, swallowing my discomfort to keep the peace. The kitchen incident forced me to recognize that keeping the peace at the expense of my own well-being wasn't actually peaceful at all. Setting boundaries felt uncomfortable and scary, especially when Linda reacted so explosively, but it was absolutely necessary for my mental health and the health of my marriage. I learned that I could be kind and firm simultaneously, that saying no wasn't cruel or selfish, and that people who truly love you will respect your boundaries, even when they don't like them. Mark and I grew closer through this experience in ways I hadn't anticipated. Dealing with his mother's behavior together as a united front strengthened our communication and our trust in each other. Mark learned that protecting our marriage sometimes meant disappointing his mother, and that was okay. He learned to listen when I expressed discomfort instead of immediately defending his mother's intentions. We both learned that a strong marriage requires presenting a united front to outside influences, even when those influences are family members. The boundaries we set with Linda also helped us get clearer about boundaries in other areas of our lives, making us better communicators and partners overall. If I could give advice to anyone dealing with a similar situation, it would be this: trust your instincts when something feels wrong.
If someone's behavior makes you uncomfortable, even if they claim they're just trying to help, you have every right to set boundaries around that behavior. You don't need to accept disrespect or boundary violations just because someone is family. Changing the locks on your own home to protect your privacy and peace is not an overreaction when someone has proven they can't be trusted with access. Installing security cameras isn't paranoid when you need to protect your space. Standing up for yourself isn't mean or selfish, it's necessary and healthy. And remember, people who genuinely care about you will work to respect your boundaries even when it's uncomfortable for them. The other crucial lesson from this experience is the importance of partner unity when dealing with difficult family members. If Mark hadn't eventually stood up for me and our boundaries, this situation could have destroyed our marriage. Too many relationships suffer because one partner expects the other to just tolerate poor treatment from in-laws to keep the peace. But real peace doesn't come from one person constantly sacrificing their comfort and dignity. It comes from partners protecting each other, respecting each other, and presenting a united front against anyone who threatens their relationship. Mark's willingness to stand up to his mother, even though it was painful and difficult, showed me that he truly valued our marriage above all else. I also want to acknowledge that situations like this are rarely black and white, and people aren't simply villains or heroes. Linda genuinely thought she was helping when she reorganized the kitchen, even though her actions were completely inappropriate. Her controlling behavior came from deeper issues around anxiety and feeling needed. Understanding where her behavior came from didn't excuse it, but it did help me have compassion for her struggles while still maintaining firm boundaries. You can acknowledge someone's pain or motivations while still protecting yourself from their harmful actions. Empathy and boundaries aren't mutually exclusive. In fact, they work best together. The financial aspect of this situation is worth mentioning too, because setting boundaries sometimes costs money. Between the locksmith, the smart doorbell camera, replacing items Linda threw away, and even the therapy sessions, we spent several $100s addressing this situation. Some people might say that's too expensive just to make a point, but I'd argue that protecting your peace and privacy is worth every penny. You can't put a price on feeling safe and respected in your own home. Those locks and that camera weren't luxuries, they were necessary investments in our well-being and our sense of security. If anything, I wish we'd made those investments sooner. One unexpected positive outcome from this whole situation was the improvement in my relationship with Mark's siblings. His sister called me after hearing about everything, and we had a long conversation about their mother's boundary issues. She shared experiences from her own life where Linda had overstepped, and we bonded over our shared frustration. She'd been dealing with Linda's controlling behavior for years, but had never found the courage to confront it directly. Watching Mark and me set boundaries gave her permission to start setting her own. She told me I'd done the whole family a favor by refusing to accept Linda's behavior because it forced everyone to acknowledge patterns they'd been ignoring for decades. There's also something to be said about the power of documentation in situations like this. The photographs I took of my rearranged kitchen, the video footage of Linda trying to enter our apartment, the saved text messages and voicemails, all of that evidence was crucial. When people gaslight you or minimize your concerns, having concrete proof of what happened protects your sanity. Linda tried multiple times to claim she hadn't done anything wrong or that we were exaggerating, but we had receipts. That documentation also helped family members understand the severity of the situation instead of just hearing Linda's version of events. In any conflict, especially family conflict, protecting yourself with evidence isn't petty or paranoid, it's smart.
The psychological impact of having your space violated is something people don't talk about enough. After Linda's kitchen invasion, I felt anxious in my own home for weeks. I would come home from work and immediately check every room to make sure nothing had been moved or touched. I felt hyper-vigilant and couldn't fully relax because part of me was always worried about another violation. The doorbell camera helped with this anxiety because I could check it throughout the day and confirm that no one had approached our door. It took months before I felt completely comfortable and at peace in my apartment again. The violation of privacy and autonomy had lasting effects that went beyond just having to reorganize some cabinets.
Today, more than half a year after the initial incident, my kitchen is still organized exactly the way I want it, and it brings me joy every single day. Every time I reach for a spice and find it exactly where I expect it to be, every time I grab a pot from the lower cabinet without stretching, every time I use my measuring cups or dish towels, I'm reminded that I stood up for myself. I protected my space, my marriage, and my peace. Those new locks on our door represent more than just security. They represent autonomy, boundaries, and self-respect. That doorbell camera does more than record visitors. It provides evidence that we have the right to control access to our private space. My relationship with Linda will probably never be the warm, close connection that some people have with their mothers-in-law, and I've made peace with that. We're cordial, we're respectful, and we're working on trust, but there's always going to be a certain distance there now. The innocence and benefit of the doubt are gone, replaced by cautious interaction and firm boundaries. Some relationships can't be fully repaired after major violations, and that's okay. You don't have to force closeness with someone just because they're family. Sometimes the healthiest relationship is one that maintains appropriate distance and clear expectations. The story of my mother-in-law rearranging my kitchen and me changing the locks might seem like a dramatic overreaction to some people, but to me it represents something much bigger. It's about knowing your worth, protecting your peace, and refusing to accept treatment that violates your boundaries. It's about recognizing that meaning well doesn't excuse harmful behavior, and that family relationships require mutual respect to be healthy. It's about understanding that sometimes the kindest thing you can do for a relationship is to set firm boundaries, even when the other person reacts badly. Those new locks weren't just about keeping Linda out, they were about creating a home where Mark and I felt safe, respected, and in control of our own space. So yes, my mother-in-law rearranged my entire kitchen while I was at work, and yes, I changed the locks in response. Would I do it again? Absolutely, without hesitation, because at the end of the day, my home is my sanctuary, my marriage is my priority, and my boundaries are non-negotiable. Linda learned a hard lesson about respect and consequences. Mark learned about standing up for our partnership, and I learned about the power of protecting myself with action instead of just words. The kitchen incident became a defining moment in our family dynamics, one that ultimately led to healthier relationships built on respect rather than control. And honestly, that outcome is better than any revenge I could have planned.